This is not good. I'll start. Tell me when we're on. What's that sheet of questions?
So two participants.
We're on.
You're on.
Now?
Yeah.
They can hear me?
Yes.
This is George Gruhn from Gruhn Guitars. Looking forward to our first session on Zoom for question and answer with me. This is the sort of thing we can't really rehearse. I don't know what questions are coming, but what I do have in the way of preparation is 57 years of practice collecting, feeling, appraising, and responding to customer questions over the years. These days, with the coronavirus pandemic hitting worldwide, people are sequestering themselves. Many showrooms, ours included, are closed, although we are able to handle email, telephone calls, online orders. We receive and ship with UPS. So we are very much in business, although we look forward to the day, hopefully in the near future, when the showroom will be open and we'll be able to interact direct with people. In the meantime, Zoom can help to connect us. So I'm looking forward to your questions. And I hope all of you are healthy and doing as best you can. I can think of worse things to do than be stuck at home with a few guitars, banjos, and mandolins to play. But in the meantime, I'm looking forward to your questions. So I'll be on.
As a technical note, please use your chat box at the bottom of the screen to ask the questions. We've turned off audio so that we don't hear background noise and so that everyone can listen clearly. And so just use your chat box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and we'll be monitoring it during the session. Thank you so much. So you can start with your questions then.
I've got a few questions that I can start with, and then we will respond to those who are writing in now. Jim in Katy, Texas asks, to what extent does the removal of the neck from a guitar, say a 1950s Fender Tele or Strat, destabilize the instrument or change the character or sound of that instrument? Well, if you take the neck off of a Fender and you change the neck set angle, then you may be adjusting the tension of the strings, the action, and certainly that can change sound. But if you take the neck off and bolt it back, correct tension, and the same position, there's no logical reason why it should be noticeably different. Uh, all too often people over tighten the screws in the neck on an older Fender, and they can strip the wood. That can cause the neck to no longer have as stable a seating. But otherwise, if one uses common sense, it should not change the sound of the instrument or the playability. The instrument was designed so that it could be disassembled and reassembled. But again, don't over tighten the screws. A question from Thomas. Hopefully we'll both be around 30 years from now. What do you see the store selling at that time? Is a market still a market for golden era instruments? Maybe a huge resurgence of popularity for zithers. Well, I think he's probably being a bit facetious about the zithers. But 30 years from now, I would be 94 and a half years old. It's a little hard for me to predict exactly what the market is. I can tell you from direct personal experience that prognostication tends to be a lot fuzzier than hindsight. And my own predictions for 10 or 20 years in the future have often been somewhat off. I can at least say, though, that for my entire career, the instruments that have been the most sought after have been the ones that I consider to be golden era. Not necessarily vintage in terms of a specific number of years of age. For example, when I opened up the shop in January of 1970, a 30-year-old guitar was made in 1940. And that means there were very few electric guitars of any merit back then, a few, such as the Gibson ES-150, but the Fender Broadcaster was only a 20-year-old guitar in 1970, and the oldest Stratocaster in the world was about 16 years old in 1970. It's not simply a matter of age. Today, a 50-year-old guitar is 1970, and I don't consider that to be a golden era instrument. But 30 years from now, I would predict that the true golden era instruments, such as 1930s Martins and electric guitars by Gibson, Fender, and Gretsch made in the 50s through the early 60s, will still be some of the most valuable ones. But it is worth noting that many of the new guitars made today are superior in quality to those made 30 or 40 years ago. And 30 or 40 years ago was not the golden era. On the other hand, for specific makers, individual hand builders, such as, for example, John Monteleone or Stephen Gilchrist, the best ones that they make are often enough their newest ones. And quality counts. So a D'Angelico guitar made in 1964, the year he died, is a great guitar. Better probably than almost anything he ever made in the 1930s when he had less experience. So golden era for each individual maker may be somewhat different. And 30 years from now, I still expect those that are true golden era pieces, prime examples of the maker's work, will still be highly sought after. And the quality of instruments 30 years from now, I cannot judge today. We only will have to know, we'll only know that 30 years from now. Similarly, Phil Munzio from Connecticut asked, how do you view the vintage market in 2040? Similarities and differences compared to 2020. Valuable brands in 2040. Well, again, I think the golden era pieces will be the great ones, but I don't know which individual builders will be producing what quality in 2040 or 2050. That remains to be seen. But superb quality new instruments do indeed compete with old instruments from a utility standpoint, and also even from a collectible standpoint. If it's a maker like John Monteleone or Jimmy DeQuisto, who died in 1995, those instruments may not be as old as some of the golden era Martins or Gibsons, but they are golden era instruments for what they are. They're great. The quality of art or instruments is not simply a function of age. Another question from the same person: how viable are specialty, privately owned music stores and big box stores moving forward? How will the retail musical instrument marketplace change in the future? Well, right now, some big box stores are in trouble, and some small specialty shops are doing great. On the other hand, some really big individual stores like Sweetwater in the USA is doing over $800 million a year in sales, and they're doing very fine. Or Thomann in the EU is doing close to $1 billion a year in sales. They're doing just fine. They may only have one location, but it be strong. And there are others that may have multiple locations and be $1 billion in debt. Right now, with the current market in which many dealers are closed, we face challenging times in somewhat uncharted water. But what I can tell you is those who have strong online presence can still do well, and those who have truly superb quality instruments are still doing well. Another one, Larry Rutch, Ottawa, Canada. When was the period in time when it became apparent that these old, off-the-shelf Fenders were going to have tremendous value one day? Well, the fact is, I've been personally collecting guitars as far back as 1963. And as early as 1965, it was very evident that the older guitars were better than many of the new ones. Sure enough, by 1966, it was really clear, because by that time, the quality of new Gibson and Fender electric guitars had gone into a nosedive compared to what it was even 2 years previous. I remember very well in 1966 comparing a new Fender Stratocaster to a 1964 model, and it was amazing how different they were in playability and sound. And the same can be said for Gibson, but again, the management in both of those companies had changed. Ted Bacardi had left Gibson, and Fender had sold out to CBS, and the quality changed. And it didn't take long at all for players to realize that there was a big difference. So we didn't dream that they would be as expensive as some are today. If somebody were to have told me in 1966 or 7 that a Sunburst Les Paul Standard would someday bring $300,000 on up, I would have found it difficult to believe. But by the time Mike Bloomfield was playing one of those type guitars in the 60s, we knew that they were special. And they were indeed sought after. We have plenty more questions. Here's one from Aaron. George, you've been through many economic uncertainties. We're all wondering how the COVID crisis could affect instrument values. Can you briefly explain how vintage instrument values were affected by different recessions, wars, and other major events? Well, in the 50 years that I've been in business since opening Gruhn Guitars, certainly we've seen economic ups and downs. I didn't know much better at the time when I opened the store, but 1970 was something of an economic recession. It was a tough time to get started. But 1974 was another recession. And the earliest, or the worst one, I guess, that I could say prior to the COVID crisis today was probably in the early 1980s. At that time, prime rate interest was at 20% early during Ronald Reagan's term of office, and Paul Volcker was chairman of the Federal Reserve. Prime rate at 20% was a rate that most people couldn't get. That was if you were prime, but most people had to pay prime plus 3 or 4%. And credit card interest was as high as 27%. It was impossible for customers to really use a credit card and pay interest to buy a good guitar and pay it over time. And certainly to take a business loan at as much as 25% would be suicidal. That was a rough time. That was rougher, in my memory, even than the economic downturn that we encountered in 2008. But today, we're in uncharted water. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused many dealers to be closed by order of state governors or local mayors. And that's a worldwide situation. It's going to take time to really assess what this is going to do. But what I can tell you is that in our experience right now, prime quality instruments are still in demand. And those who are in a position to supply that demand are still selling instruments. And I don't anticipate the economy rebounding quickly. I don't anticipate music venues having large concerts until there is a viable vaccine available, and that could take a year or more. And even then, I don't expect the economy to come roaring back. In fact, the only thing I expect to come roaring back, if too many restrictions are removed, is the virus itself may come roaring back. But in the meantime, I'm actually optimistic that the musical instrument market will persevere and that fine quality instruments will continue to be in demand. Another question I just got from a Jess Robinson in Fairfax, Virginia. I'd like your thoughts on the assertion that in large scale guitar production is one instrument in 100 or 1,000 or even 1,000,000 that's the one or gifted. By gifted, I mean has a unique and brilliant voice. The body resonates perfectly and the fretboard is joyful to navigate. It's singular to that model's run. Perhaps pieces of the wood are highest grade, grain lines perfectly aligned, bracing and glue immaculate randomness worked in its favor. Well, the fact is today, the quality of most new instruments by major manufacturers is better than it was even 40 or 50 years ago. Not necessarily better than the golden era period, but some of the best made in the lifetime of most of my customers, and definitely good enough to be used professionally on stage by discriminating artists. And I don't think that it is so rare that one has to expect it's only going to be 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000. The fact is that when we get new custom shop instruments from Martin, or new Fender guitars, and for that matter, new custom shop Gibson guitars, they are good instruments. While I don't think they're necessarily better than golden era, they are truly, absolutely stage worthy, studio worthy. And I don't feel that you have to go through 1,000 of them to find one that's good. The custom shop Martins that we sell that are made to our specs, especially the ones with sinker mahogany, are uniformly extremely good instruments. And I agree, each one has a voice of its own, and you may play some and find that certain ones really stand out. But the fact is, uniformity is good when the quality is good. And the quality of a lot of new instruments today is actually quite fine. This is particularly true, actually, not only of high-end instruments, but also of some of the student-grade models. I remember very well the old Harmony and Kay guitars of the 1960s that were, at least in the case of the acoustic models, difficult to play even before they left the shop. The neck set angles were poor, the truss rods didn't work, they were physically uncomfortable to play. And today, a lot of those instruments are rare because even though they were made in large quantity, they were so poorly made that they fell apart and they were not practical to fix. Today, student model instruments with more computer numeric controlled CNC equipment produce specs often accurate to within 1 or 2 thousandths of an inch, have better comfortable necks, have truss rods that actually work, have intonation that is good, and are physically comfortable to play, and actually will last for many years. So one does not necessarily have to go through 1,000 New Martin, Gibson, or Fender, or Taylor guitars to find the one that's good. The uniformity is actually quite remarkable, but there is still a certain special something that no two pieces of wood are quite alike. And I agree that certain ones speak to me more than others. But the other fact is no two musicians' touch is exactly the same. And the guitar that suits me the best may not suit you the best. It is a good idea to be able to come in and sit down and try out half a dozen guitars to find the one that speaks to you. But the quality of new instruments is good from all the major manufacturers today. Here's one from a fellow named Jim. I'm looking at my long-term investments, and as a guitar player for many years, I've always wanted a Blackguard Telly. What is your opinion on these guitars as an investment? Do you think they will continue to go up in value? The Blackguard Fender Telecasters made from 51 through mid-54 are great guitars, and in my opinion are the best Telecasters ever made. So far as how much will they go up in the future, we'll also have to ask inflation adjusted, how much will they go up? Because the dollar has not been stable in value. So when they were new, they didn't cost near as many dollars as they do today, but a dollar in the 1950s took a lot more hours of labor to earn than a dollar does today. So prices have changed. And for that matter, Martin guitars in the mid-1930s, a D28 Martin was $100 list price, and the wholesale price was $50. It's amazing that Martin, in the depth of the Depression, could actually make a herringbone D28 with Brazilian rosewood and Adirondack spruce top and charge only $50 wholesale, and dealers doubled their money on them. But the fact is that today, prices have stabilized to a significant extent. There was a market bubble from mid-2002 through late 2006. And when the market economically and with collectors also went down in 2008, partially as a result of financial missteps in the market that affected the entire economy, but also a result of changes of demographics where the baby boom generation that had been the prime buyers had dropped out, and Generation X onward didn't necessarily share some of the same interests. It's taken time for that market to recover. But I think that at this point, Blackguard Tellys are not going down. If anything, they are back in the area of going up again. They are superlatively fine instruments. And again, the golden era instruments in general, not just Blackguard Tellys, are doing well for prime examples. On the other hand, examples that have been highly modified are not necessarily going up. Instruments that are so-called player grade, that have been highly modified or really beat up, refinished, reworked, are not great investments, whereas those that are maybe showing normal, moderate playing wear, but still quite original, are good investments. And when I talk about original, I'm not saying that a refret done professionally extremely well, or a reset of a neck on an acoustic done very professionally and extremely well. That's still a good thing. That adds value as compared to one that needs work. What's prime and best is to have something pristine original, not a scratch on it, never needed work, doesn't need any adjustment. That's rarer and rarer each year that goes by. And in addition, that's something that if it's so pristine, you hardly feel safe taking it on stage and using it, because that's something that if you get a single scratch on, the value goes down dramatically. So good players often want an instrument that is structurally sound, cosmetically good, shows moderate normal wear, but is set up in superb playing order and has all the sound and playability of a golden era instrument. Those are fun to play, and you don't have to be afraid to play them. You can use them. I'm open for questions. So here's another question. I own a Paramount branded parlor guitar, birch body, ladder braced construction, trapeze tailpiece, a great country / blues guitar. What do you know, and can you shed light on the Paramount brand? Paramount was a brand originally by Retberg and Lang in New York City. They were specialists in banjos, although they did have a few guitars, but in general, Paramount brand was a banjo brand. And later, they had some guitars made under the Paramount name by Martin for Paramount. And those instruments were very different in construction from a standard Martin, but Martin and Gibson, as well as a number of other companies such as Harmony and Kay, made other brand names under a variety of different brand names for a variety of different suppliers and wholesalers. And especially during the Depression, it was not beneath their dignity to do this. And the one described, however, birch body and ladder braced construction, that would clearly be something after Retberg and Lang sold their company to B&J wholesalers in New York. That guitar being described here was probably made by Harmony in Chicago and would be worth hundreds, but not thousands of dollars. It would be a good utility tool, but not something that in my mind would be viewed as a great collectible. Question from Aaron. Says, George, you've been through many economic uncertainties. Excuse me, that's his second question from the same person. I love learning more about vintage mandolins. Can you compare the build tone and build character of Lloyd Loar mandolins from 1922 until his departure? Lloyd Loar was Gibson's acoustic engineer at Gibson from about 1919 till his departure in 1924, December. He was the one who signed the signature labels in the original Style 5 master model Gibson instruments, consisting of the F5 mandolin, the L5 guitar, the H5 mandola, and the K5 mandocello. These are the rarest and most sought after of the Gibson mandolin family instruments, and the L5 was Gibson's first archtop F-hole guitar, very fine quality instrument. The earliest of the mandolins with F5 model had a wider neck and a three-piece neck construction, whereas the later ones by late 22 had a somewhat narrower neck and one-piece maple construction of the neck. But all of the Loar signed F5s are superb instruments. But in general, the earlier 1922 F5s feel different simply because the neck dimensions are quite different. But the F5 mandolins are uniformly great quality instruments throughout the 1920s, but particularly the Loar signed ones. Loar is often credited with having designed the instrument, but the fact is he's the one who signed the labels. The design work was a team effort, and the F5 was introduced to kickstart mandolin sales when the mandolin orchestra boom was dying. And frankly, it was about as much good as introducing the best buggy whip in the world after the invention of the automobile. Classical players just simply were no longer interested in playing mandolins. The Dixieland banjo boom was on, and the F5 and the other master models were a commercial failure when they were introduced, but later they were in effect rediscovered and repurposed. The F5 mandolin turned out to be ideally suited for bluegrass, and in the hands of Bill Monroe, it became the mandolin of choice. And today those instruments bring big money. They are by far the most valuable mandolins ever made by any maker in the history of the instrument. And that is something super special. But the quality of each one, I would have to say, it's not that you can say all 22 sound alike, all 23 sound alike, but in 22 and 23, they're uniformly great. In 24, most of them had what was called a Viersy tone producer. It was a wood disc suspended from the top bracing in the middle of the body. And this was supposed to even out the tone. And for classical style playing, and most of the bluegrassers don't like that. So the ones that tend to bring the most money are the ones without the Viersy tone producer. And but in general, any F5 signed by Loar is going to be a great instrument. Another one, Tom Griswold, Overland Park, Kansas. My wife and I are privileged to own a beautiful Guild Studio 24, one of our very favorite guitars. Can you please comment on the background of this instrument and specifically what you had in mind in its design? I was personally involved with design work for Guild guitars from mid-1984 through late 1988, and from August of 86 through the end of 88, I was Guild's Executive Vice President of Research and Development and Artist Relations. This was a position that put me in a position to be able to design quite a variety of new models. The Studio 24 was a double cutaway acoustic oval hole flat top guitar. The prototype was built in our shop in Nashville, and Guild made a limited run, approximately 30 instruments of this model. They sold almost instantly as soon as they were offered, but Willie Fritcher, the plant manager, decided that they were more trouble to build than he thought was economically practical, and he pulled the plug on the project. But today, those guitars are quite sought after. They are one of the very, very few commercially made double cutaway flat top guitars ever made. These instruments feature a 24 fret fingerboard, and the full length of the board is accessible. So they do actually have a long neck. There were other makers such as Martin did a few double cutaway guitars, but the heel of the neck was still at the 14th fret. And frankly, if you were blindfolded playing it, you wouldn't know the difference between double cutaway and single cutaway. On that, it did not give access to the full length of the fingerboard. But the Guild was a most unique guitar, and it was a model that I was well pleased to do. But Guild has since that time changed ownership a number of times. It went from the Guild company I was affiliated with to bankrupting and being sold to Chuck Foz, who later sold it to Fender. And then Fender moved it from Westerly, Rhode Island to Corona, California, and later to Tacoma, Washington, and later to New Hartford, Connecticut, which was a mere 61 miles away from where it had started in Westerly, Rhode Island, when Fender acquired the company. And today, Guilds are made in California. So it's the same name, They have some of the same designs, they have the same trademarks, but it's different people, different equipment, different building. And again, it's still Guild, but it's transformed enough that there's no real pieces of the original Guild company there, but some of the designs still resemble earlier Guilds. But the Studio 24 is not one of them. Okay. Marshall Cohen, George, do you think there will be any changes positively or negatively in the marketplace for 60s Fenders, e.g. Tellys, Strats, Jazz, and P-Basses, as we baby boomers, like those of us 65 to 75 years old, downsize our collections, or perhaps even stop playing? Well, the fact is, over the years, some of my very best customers have been baby boomers. And I myself am 74 and 1/2 years old. I'm not slowing down. I'm still working 6 days a week. And while I could retire, I don't wish to. I'm still having much too much fun being here and look forward to the time when we open the showroom again and I can see people in person. But in the meantime, here we are on Zoom. But do I think that these instruments will maintain value? We've sort of discussed it already. The true golden era instruments will remain as such. Instruments from the 70s are not golden era in my mind, but they may have nostalgia value. If you want a guitar just exactly like Jimi Hendrix played at Woodstock, that's going to cost because it's a memorabilia type item, or at least it's a nostalgia type item. I don't view it as being as good as a 1957 or a 1965, but it's still an instrument that worked for Jimmy. And it's an instrument that, if you have one like that, will bring good money today. But of course, if Jimmy himself owned it, it's worth a fortune. If it's one just like it, it's still worth some thousands of dollars, but nowhere near as much as if he personally owned it. But the memorabilia market is a very different market. We have a memorabilia market, we have a nostalgia market, and we have a golden era market, and we have a utilitarian market. And in some ways, they are separate markets. But the true golden era instruments that are really the old collectibles, pre-CBS Fenders, are going to maintain their value, in my opinion. And I think that will be true for the rest of my life, which I hope will be a good number of years. My great uncle Otto lived to be 105, but his sister Emma only made it to 102, but neither one of them ever retired. So I figure there's still some future for me to observe the market for a while. I just have to stay physically healthy during the coronavirus pandemic. And if I can do that, which I expect to, then I expect to see the market continue. In fact, as I said earlier, we're still doing quite well. We're still selling instruments. We're doing it with a skeleton crew, smaller crew, because we are not able to have 25 people in the building like it used to be. But we still remain profitable, and we still are handling plenty of requests every day. Teddy Stern, 2 questions. 1, what advice would you have for getting into the vintage guitar buy/sell/trade world? I've been an enthusiast for a while, but I'm now starting to ponder whether it would be possible to make a go of it as a career. Put another way, what advice would you have given yourself when you were first starting out? Well, for one thing, the advice for somebody starting out in the mid-60s would be different from the advice starting out today. Back when I started out, pawn shops were filled with old guitars, and the pawnbrokers in general didn't know much about them. They were great deals. And for that matter, a 10-year-old guitar in 1965 was 1955, which for electrics was a true golden era instrument. Today, a 50-year-old instrument is 1970, and that's not exactly golden era. And the fact is also the number of guitars made per year today by the major manufacturers is vastly greater than it used to be. Companies like Martin and Taylor and Gibson all make lots of guitars. Martin and Taylor each make over 100,000 guitars a year today. Back in the 60s, they were making at Martin about 6,500 guitars a year. That's quite a difference. The market is not flooded with true golden era instruments, but there are literally millions of 1970s and 80s and 90s guitars in good condition available on the market today as used instruments. Most of those are not necessarily going to be great collectibles. But also, how to get into the business. You can't just run over to the pawn shop today and find near the quality or quantity of great deals it used to be. The pawnbrokers today look up on Google or Reverb and see what things are bringing, and instead of trying to sell it themselves, they're likely to list themselves on Reverb or eBay. They're likely to ask prices similar enough to what a knowledgeable dealer will ask, except that a lot of theirs are not in prime condition. I don't find that there's much available in pawn shops anymore. When I started out, I used to find instruments in the classified section of the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times when I was a student at University of Chicago. So I could walk to a bunch of pawn shops. There was a used instrument store nearby that I could walk to, and I could check the classified ads in the paper every day. And the classified ads would have pages of guitars. There's no classified ads for guitars in the newspapers anymore. And so far as finding a bunch of screaming deals on eBay or Reverb, it's not that easy. And in fact, many of the instruments listed online are not necessarily described accurately. I personally do virtually no buying on either Reverb or eBay. So how does one get started today? It's not so easy. It depends how much you know. But I can say that if you really are knowledgeable and you've spent the time to study the instruments, you can find that there are deals that crop up. And if you look long enough, and you yourself are a collector, for every one that you find that is of personal interest to you, you'll probably come up with 20 or 30 that are great deals on things you don't want, but you know where you can flip them. That's how I got started. I didn't get started with the intention of becoming a dealer. I was a collector at heart. But as I was going through all the instruments I turned up in the classified ads, in pawn shops and music stores, when I looked, I found all these byproducts that were turning up. And I would buy them if they were priced cheap enough that I knew where to flip them quickly. Because as a student in college with no job and no income other than the fact that mom and dad gave me money at the beginning of each month to pay apartment rent, books, food, etc., I'd spend all that money on guitars, flip some, and then within a week or two, have that money back so I could pay all my bills. That's got me started. It's sort of like mining for gold. You find a likely looking stream, and you start panning for gold or set up a sluice box. It's more efficient than panning. And for every time you get a gold nugget, you set it apart in this little pile. But then if you see a copper nugget, it's not what you're looking for, but you don't throw it away. You put it in another pile. If it's pyrite, fool's gold, you grab it because you think it's gold, then you disgust it, but you still find there's some market for that stuff. You put it in another pile, turquoise in another. At the end of the month, you got 200 tons of gravel that some paving company will pay you for, and they'll take it away. And the other stuff, they bring thousands of dollars. At the end of the month, you have a quarter ounce of gold. It's not enough to make a ring out of. Even my wedding ring here has more gold than that. But you're a hobbyist gold miner, but you're making good money on the other stuff. That's how I got started. And if you become a collector, which is in effect an addiction, you'll find that out soon enough. You'll have withdrawal symptoms if you haven't gotten one in the last week or two or month or however often your addiction has built up to. The addiction can be self-sufficient. That's how people get started as antique dealers. It's how they get started as art dealers. It's how they get started, used to be coin dealers and stamp dealers, but postage stamps and coins are not as collected by as many people as they used to be. But that's how one can get started. The next question says, how can I form real connections in the music world when I live in a place where no one seems interested in it? Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, yet surprisingly bland. Facebook and such are good, but they feel slightly lacking. Do you have any advice on this matter? Well, one, I have plenty of customers who are from the Washington, D.C. area and can tell you that there are people there. So I'm surprised that you're having difficulty finding them. Now, right now, all the music clubs are closed, but they're going to open again sometime. And if you go and you ask around in the right places, you will find that there are people who are indeed interested. If you look at Craigslist, eBay, Reverb, and look for the people in your area, you're going to find that there's lots of people you can connect with. And the Washington, D.C. area actually, rather than being totally bland and having no music, is a hotbed of musical activity. There's plenty of bluegrass music, there's plenty of country music, and there's plenty of virtually every other kind of music. And with the internet and simply just getting out there and talking to people, I have no doubt whatever but that you can find places. Also, there's music stores, just like Veneman's in Wheaton, Maryland. That's just a suburb of DC. They're big, and they can turn you on to people who are interested in the music scene. Call around to the various music stores, some of which may be closed right now, but they're not going to be closed forever. The COVID-19 crisis is not forever, but certainly it's with us now. So you may have difficulty making some of the connections now, except online, but those connections are there. Chuck Callahan, I own a 1991 National Resophonic steel tricone. It was one of the first 70 made by the new company and was originally ordered and sold by Gruhn Guitars. Can you discuss the history of the Resonator guitar and the relative desirability / collectability of these modern versions? Well, first I would say that the modern versions have great utility, but not great collectability. However, when the National Tricones were first introduced or reintroduced by National Resophonic, their quality was very good to the point where it rivaled the quality and actually was better in physical playability, ease of playability, action, having an adjustable truss rod in the neck. They played physically better than the pre-World War II originals, and they sounded remarkably good. And the pre-World War II originals actually went down in price and collectability when the new National Resophonics came out. One of the very few examples in my entire career in which I've seen a new reproduction vintage style instrument actually cause the value of vintage originals to go down. But it is also one of the few cases in which the original didn't play as well as the new one. The quality of the necks on the old National round necks was not very good. Most of the National Resophonic tricones, originally from the 20s and 30s, were square hollow neck for Hawaiian style only, and they did only a very limited number of round neck models. But at any rate, what you have, I don't view as a great collectible, but I do view it as an extremely fine utilitarian instrument. Richard Craig, are you concerned about how hand sanitizers or disinfectants might react with vintage guitar finishes once your store reopens? I'd hate to lose the chance to sit and play great old guitars there. Hand sanitizers have an alcohol and aloe base, and that is not likely to react negatively with nitrocellulose lacquer or polyurethane. However, many vintage instruments made by Martin, those made prior to 1926, have French polish finishes, which were a shellac-based hand-rubbed finish with an alcohol-soluble base. And hand sanitizers with alcohol and French polish are not a good combination. Many modern classical guitars also have French polish finishes. Very few true serious classical guitar players want a lacquer finish, and certainly don't want a polyurethane finish in general. But any French polish finish is one that we would be very hesitant to have somebody get in contact with hand sanitizer. But other than that, no, I'm not overly concerned. And the other thing is, if you use a hand sanitizer, we still expect that you're not going to be playing the instrument with your hands still wet. The alcohol does evaporate, and it evaporates quickly. So that actually, even with the French polish, if you use common sense, is not likely to be a serious problem. Cameron, how do you see the vintage market affected by the plethora of amazing guitar builders and the quality instruments coming out of their shops today? A guy with $5,000 to $10,000 to spend on a nice guitar is a tough decision to make. With a generation of younger people who tend to appreciate current craftsmanship over vintage instruments, you see this having an adverse effect on the value of vintage guitars. The one-word answer is no. I don't see it really having an enormous impact. To a large extent, the vintage instrument market and the market for boutique new guitars are quite separate markets. I can also say that there are only a very few of the boutique builders of acoustic guitars or electric guitars, either one, that have impressed me as building a truly better guitar than the better golden era pieces. The brand new Martin custom shop guitars actually give virtually any of the boutique builders a real run for the money. Companies like Martin, Gibson, and Fender declined in quality from the mid-1960s through the 1970s and on into the 1980s, after which they got competition from smaller manufacturers such as Collings, Santa Cruz, and later Hudson Dalton. And there are a variety of makers today that are small shops or small factories. These days, actually, a company like Collings is a significant powerhouse in its own way with close to 100 employees. It's not exactly an individual little boutique shop anymore. But companies like Martin had to respond to that. They didn't simply respond to Taylor. Taylor is a competitor of Martin, but the Taylor and Martin guitars are quite different from each other to the point where the customer base is actually quite different. They're not necessarily competing so directly with each other as, for example, Martin might be competing more directly with Collings or Santa Cruz or Huss and Dalton. But Martin used to have only one basic line, their standard line. But later they came out with their technology series for those who wanted a guitar that cost 20 or 30% less. They did that, and they did it well. And then they came out with their vintage series and their golden era series and their marquee series and the authentic series and custom shop. And those items compete very directly with companies like Collings, Santa Cruz, Huss and Dalton, etc. And we find that the new custom shop instruments by companies such as Martin, but also Gibson and Fender are really good instruments and feature quality work, quality materials. Not all the boutique builders impress me as being better. In fact, some I think are a poor quality investment. But to lump them all together would be doing a disservice. There are hundreds. In fact, if you start getting into the amateur builders, there are thousands of people building guitars today. They're not all the same. Just because something is handmade does not mean it's better than something made in a factory. The quality standards from Martin, Taylor, Collings are very good. And Martin and Gibson and Fender in their golden era were factory produced instruments. They were not things that one individual luthier sat down at a bench and built by hand start to finish. Makers such as today Monteleone in Long Island, New York does marvelous work, but his base price is $50,000 to build an instrument. And if you want any ornamentation, it's going to be more, on up to $100,000 plus, some of them as much as $200,000. And a few have been more than that. There's numerous builders we can name, but the point is, Gilchrist makes a great mandolin. Monteleone makes great archtop guitars. And there are a host of these builders out there, and you have to judge them individually, not as a group. Each boutique builder is a maker unto himself, and his standards are exactly that, his standards. Some of them do superb work. Some of them make fancy instruments that I think are beautiful cabinetry and may have ornamental flummadiddles, but I may not be impressed. I'm still highly impressed with the utilitarian quality of instruments made today by the major manufacturers, some of the same manufacturers that have been in business for 50 plus years. And some that have maybe a little less in terms of years, like Taylor didn't get started till 74, but the best Taylor guitars made are the ones, in my opinion, that are made right now. Their quality has gotten constantly better. Their standards of workmanship are to exacting tolerances. A great deal of it is machine work, but they are meticulously designed machines and jigs and patterns. And a tour of the Taylor factory is actually a very interesting experience. They know what they're doing. And the uniformity is there. Does it sound exactly like a Martin or feel like a Martin? No. Is it going to work for a bluegrass player exactly like a Martin does? The answer is, in my opinion, no. But they each have their own place, and the quality of workmanship is extremely good from both. And it's a matter of personal preference and what style of music you're playing as to which one suits you the best. But the boutique market in the $5,000 to $10,000 bracket, in my opinion, is not necessarily better from individual hand builders than it is from some of the major manufacturers that are producing custom shop instruments in that same price bracket. Let's see. More questions.
Have you been looking at these?
Okay. From John.
John
Politio, how do you see the vintage guitar market in the next 10 years, specifically due to the younger generation not taking up an instrument? Thank you. The younger generation consists, that's sort of lumping them all together. Like I was just saying, not all boutique builders are the same. Not all members of the younger generation are the same either. Some of the younger generation, including kids under 10 years old, I've seen, are very good players and are very interested in guitars. And that causes me to be optimistic. But for those who are into rap, hip hop, and disco or DJ sounds, the fact is, if DJ equipment is what you think is the right stuff to compose music with, you're right, that doesn't help guitars. But I do see younger folks playing guitar. Often enough, though, again, if they're into a lot of the modern music, they may play a $400 or $500 guitar and spend $1,500 on their pedal board. And instead of buying multiple guitars, if they want a new sound, they buy a new pedal. And that doesn't personally excite me. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that it's all bad music. And they do play guitars. And some of them play very competently. I think that much remains to be seen, but what I am seeing is often encouraging when I go to some of the music festivals, which today aren't happening because of COVID-19, but they too will come back. There are still music festivals that attract tens of thousands of people with lots of jam sessions going on. And I see that there is still an ongoing demand for guitars. There's not any other instrument out there that truly takes the place of the guitar. Keyboard and the guitar are two of the very few instruments that are basically a mini orchestra in itself, that you can sing and play, you can accompany yourself, and you can play with others, but you can also do a complete sound on your own without needing any other accompaniment. And it still is a rich, full sound, and it's fun to sit around and play at home, just by yourself, you and the instrument. You can play solo or you can sing with it, and just sitting around and playing it by yourself is fun. You can't do that with a tuba. It just doesn't work as a solo instrument alone, and you can't sing and play it at the same time either. It's even harder to sing and play violin at the same time, although there's a few who do, but in general, most people who sing and play violin, they do their solo on the violin and then they hold the violin while they're up against the microphone singing, and they don't try to sing and play at the same time, although there are some country folks who manage to do both. They sing, play, and dance at the same time, but that's a whole other story.
Do you plan to?
From Pascal Caputo, do you have any plans to get into the sale of vintage Japanese instruments? The fact is, we already sell some. There are some early Yamaha models and some of the old Kono classicals and flamencos that are quite good. Some of the old Ibanez, especially some of the double necks, such as some of the ones that were used. There's a number of folks who are using, there are some of those that bring thousands of dollars. So made in Japan is not necessarily a bad thing. It used to have a connotation of cheap when I was starting out in the 60s. Japanese labor was cheap and the quality was not so good. And there was not much made in Korea or anywhere else at that time. So the Japanese basically took over from the market that Harmony and Kay had filled in the US, and Dan Electro put them out of business. But later the Japanese started building better and better instruments. But even by 1974, when I went to Japan for a couple of weeks to see about what connections I could make, what I found is that hotel prices were really high there if you wanted to be in something that was nice, especially if it was anything remotely resembling Western style. But land cost more in Japan, fuel cost more, wood cost more, transportation cost more. The only thing that cost less in Japan in 1974 than it did in the US was labor, and everything else cost more. Today, labor in Japan costs every bit as much as in the US, and everything else costs more. Quality Japanese guitars today, and quality Japanese guitars ever since the mid-1980s, has been remarkably good. Even by 1974, there were some remarkably good Japanese guitars. So we don't see as many of them as I'd like, actually, but it's not beneath our dignity to sell Japanese guitars or to say that they are of good quality. In fact, some of the Japanese guitars of the 1980s, in my opinion, are better than quite a few of the Gibson electric guitars made at the same time. And the Japanese were making relatively accurate copies of golden era vintage Fender and Gibson instruments before Fender and Gibson were doing it. So one of the reasons the Japanese even, or one of the reasons that Gibson and Fender got into doing the vintage reissues was embarrassing competition from the Japanese doing it better than they were. From Rob Koss, what is the difference between the Martin 000 series and the Martin OM series, and your thoughts on that? The original Martin 000 guitars measured 15 inches wide and had a 12 fret slot head neck. And the OM model came out in late 29, OM meaning orchestra model. It was the first Martin guitar to feature a 14 fret neck, 14 frets clear of the body. And it was designed with a pick guard, and was in effect really the first model that Martin made that we could call a truly modern style flat top steel string guitar. And it featured a 25.4 inch scale, which happened to be the same scale length as the 12 fret 000. But it gave you more access, more reachable frets easily. On the other hand, the 12 fret model had just as many frets clear of the body as Segovia had. That didn't hold him or other classical guitar players back. But the OM model also had a somewhat narrower neck. The 12 fret models typically had a 1 7/8 inch wide nut, whereas the OM had a 1 3/4 inch wide nut. The OM models were excellent guitars for fingerpicking, although they were actually originally designed with the idea that jazz players might like them. And Perry Bechtel was a great plectrum banjo player, excuse me, not tenor, plectrum banjo player and jazz guitarist. And they were wooing him as a possible endorser, although he actually never did use the OM very much. It's also not true that the OM was the first 14 fret steel string guitar available. Gibson's L5 model, which was debuted in 1923, had a 14 fret neck from the beginning, but that was an archtop F-hole guitar. And even prior to that, as early as about 1910, the Gibson Scroll model, artist model style O, had 15 frets clear and a partially cut away body. So the concept of a longer neck was something already done, but the Gibson O and the Gibson L5 were arch top, carved back guitars, not flat top. But by 1933, it was obvious the OM model was doing very well for Martin, and the 000 12 frets were not selling so well. So Martin changed the model name in 1934, and the OM became the new 000. It was still 15 inches wide, and it still had a 25.4 scale until late 34, when Martin introduced a steel T-bar in the neck for reinforcement. And at that time, they went away from the old style bar frets, which were used for compression fretting, for stiffening the neck, and they used modern T frets. And the concept of the modern T fret was known to European makers even as early as 1810. But the T frets don't work well for compression fretting. So Martin had used the bar frets through late 34. But when they went to the T frets, they could do that once they used a steel T-bar, but they also reduced the scale length to 24.9 inches, so a half inch shorter than the OM model had been. It produces a little bit different sound. I personally like the 000s and the OMs about equally well. They're great guitars. We also happen to like the custom shop models we do. We do a lot of custom shop quadruple O that are 16 inches wide and the same body shape as a 000 or an OM, but a bit larger. And I happen to like the balance of sustain that they have on the 000s and OMs. Frequently, the low E string doesn't sustain quite as long as the others. It may be equal in volume when you first hit it, but the sustain tends to be not quite as long as on the other 5 strings. So I like the quadruple O size myself because it has a very uniform balance. Another question here.
Here's one right here. This is kind of a non-technical question.
Chris, what was your first guitar you owned, and do you still have it? Well, one, I don't still have it, but in my freshman year of college, I bought a Conde Hermanos Classical made in Madrid, Spain. It was $300 used for a 1959 model. It's a guitar that might be worth about $6,000 today, but it was $300 used then. And I found out real quickly that it didn't suit the style of music that I really liked. I decided I'd really rather play Carter Family, old Appalachian string band music. So I traded that, and my second guitar was about a 1915 Gibson style O artist scroll model. And I don't have that guitar anymore either. My third guitar was a 1937 Martin F7 archtop, 16 inches wide. I paid $75 for it, something that would be worth about $6,000 today. And I don't have that anymore either. My fourth guitar, I remember, was at Sid Sherman's Music in Chicago. It was the second floor building on Wabash Street and down in the Loop. $400. It was a Lloyd Loar signed Gibson L5, and they wanted $400. I didn't have $400, but I put a deposit down. It took me about 4 months to pay it off. And I was eating canned beans for a while. It took much of the money Mommy and Daddy gave me before I was quite as adept at wheeling and dealing and trading stuff. But, and I wish I had that now, but I had tax problems back in 1981 when the prime rate interest that I had discussed earlier was about 20% prime. And I sold it. And the guy I sold it to still has it, and I can't get it back from him. But I've had others since then. Here's another question that just came in. My first Gibson was an ES225 TD I purchased in 1959. Wasn't this one of the first thin line models Gibson produced? If so, why hadn't it commanded a higher price among vintage collectors? Yes, that is indeed one of the absolute first thin line, fully hollow Gibson models made. 59 would actually be one of the last of those. They made two versions. They made a 225 and a 225 TD. The TD that you had was the one with two pickups, and the T simply had one pickup, and it was located in the middle position, which most players find rather awkward. They'd rather have one either in the neck position or the bridge position, but they don't want one in the middle. But one reason why the 225 TD is not as sought after as some other models is, for one, it was not one of the really deluxe models. It's a dot inlaid, relatively plain ornamentation, and it's fully hollow. So even though it's thin, you can't crank it as loud as you could a semi-hollow. But the other more notable thing is it has a bridge tailpiece combination, similar to what Gibson had on the gold top Les Pauls in 52 and early 53, in which the bridge and tailpiece are the same unit. And the tailpiece crossbar is the bridge itself. And it doesn't intonate accurately unless you have flat wound strings with a wound third. If you put light strings on, such as most players today would like, that type bridge is not firmly anchored to the top, so it will wiggle if you bend strings, and it won't intonate well with a plain third. So that model, as a result, is not as popular today as the 330 would be, the double cutaway, or the 335, which is very much more sought after. Here is a question from John Simpson. I have a Gruhn custom Martin, and I'm curious as to how you determine the specs for a given custom order you make. Well, there are numerous models I've designed that we have made by Martin for us, and each model has its own specs. Now, the ones that we are selling the most of right now in custom shop are the ones featuring sinker mahogany for the neck, back, sides, neck block, end block, and the curved linings, and Adirondack spruce top, and ebony fingerboard and bridge. Sinker mahogany is a wood that's the same type wood from Central America and on into South America, but sinker means that it sank in water and stayed there for a long time. The particular wood that Martin is using for the custom orders that we have made comes from Belize in Central America. And this is wood that was harvested when they were actively logging in that area between 1920 on back as early as 1980, but not much after 1920. By that time, they had cut down all the major large trees. So they moved on to South America to keep harvesting mahogany. But this is virgin forest, old wood. And It's wood that grew in a dense, dimly lit forest where the trees struggled to grow. They grew slowly, and the wood grew denser. Secondary growth tends to grow in a more open setting, where it's been logged heavily. It's more light, they grow faster, but the wood is of lighter density. It can actually be as much as 50% lighter per cubic foot. And the other fact about the sinker wood is they would float the logs down the river to the sawmills, but they'd lose as much as 30%. It was a very inefficient process. There were no roads in the area, and they weren't not putting this wood on rafts. They were simply floating the logs. The heaviest logs that got waterlogged sank, and it was murky, muddy water. It just stayed there. They didn't have sonar to find it in those days. They didn't have scuba gear to go after it in those days. But now the wood is valuable enough and the technology is there to use sonar to find the logs and scuba gear to go after them. And this wood is still remarkably well preserved. There are some pieces that are not suitable, but most of it, the sap would migrate to the outer edges of the log, in effect seal it in. And even after 100 years, that wood is good. It takes a little longer to dry it, but actually not all that much more time. If you cut down a tree in the forest, especially in the tropics, there's sap in it. It's not dry. In the northern hemisphere, if you're cutting spruce, you wait until winter when the sap is down, or maple, you wait until winter when the sap is down to cut a tree. But in the tropics, that doesn't happen. The sap's always up. So drying and curing a piece of wood takes a long time. You can dry it in a kiln on a piece of wood that's from a tree that when you cut it, and it's a live tree, and several weeks later, you may have it down with humidity content is where you want it, but it's still not chemically stable. The wood goes through quite a few changes over the years, which is why most makers will age wood, if they're doing handmade instruments, at least 10 years and sometimes more. But with the sinker wood, once you get it dry, it's ready to go. It's already stabilized. The chemical changes it's going to go through have been there and done that over the course of 100 years. So it is a different sounding wood, and it makes a difference even that the neck block, end block, and the linings inside are that same wood. They sound different, and when coupled with good air seasoned, not heat treated, oven baked for Adirondack spruce, that is a magical combination. And we do those in quadruple O size. We're doing a few now in OM size. We do them in dreadnought size. And we also do them in 12 fret quadruple O, as well as the 14 fret quadruple O and some 12 strings. And these guitars appeal to me. The 12 fret quad sounds more punch than the 14 fret. The 14 fret quad sounds a little more jazzy, but also very well balanced. That's the model Vince Gill uses most with the Eagles. And it works great for his purposes. For bluegrass, the dreadnought is superb. It's hard to beat a dreadnought for that style of music. And the 12 string is a 12 fret quadruple O, and in my opinion, they're the best 12 strings I've ever played by any maker ever. But I'm listening for 5 basic things. A lot of people, when they talk about balance, all they talk about is volume. And that is one type of balance, volume. Does each string have equal volume and each note up and down the board equal volume with equal pressure? Okay. Next, I'm looking for balance of sustain. If you hit a 6-note chord, do all the notes fade at an equal rate? Do they have good sustain, and does each string fade equally? Next, I'm looking for balance of dynamic range. It's soft, medium, and loud without distortion, and it's controllable. Next, I'm looking for balance of complexity of tone. Every note on every string has a fundamental note and it has harmonics above and below that note. I'm listening for that. These are all things that are measurable. They're not simply subjective. And if it does well in that, with excellent balance of complexity of tone and finally balance of clarity of articulation, I want each note to be crisp and clear. You can always, if you want it fuzzy, use the palm of your hand on the right hand to make it fuzzy and thump, but you can't take a note that inherently is fuzzy and thumpy and make it crystal clear. It has to be clear to begin with. If you have all 5 of those things going, you have a fine guitar. It'll still sound different in different body sizes, different tonal characteristics. And if you make it with mahogany versus rosewood versus maple or some of the other woods, there are various other woods. In fact, we had another question asking if some of the alternative woods, in my opinion, will age as well. And the fact is, yes, there are some other good woods like African wenge and myrtle, but to my ear, do any of them sound better than the traditional woods? I'd have to say that in my opinion, the answer is no, they don't. Some of them approach it, but I don't feel that they're better. And but what I'm aiming for when I design a guitar is a utilitarian instrument that will do those 5 things I just outlined. And if it does that, then I'm a happy camper. But I do design instruments such that you can use, some are better for bluegrass, some are better for finger picking. But that's what I'm after. Ornamental flummadiddles help, and we certainly have some custom ones with more ornamentation than others, but I'm just as happy with the ones with relatively plain ornamentation, but beautiful body lines, good playability, great materials, great sound. That's what I'm looking for.
We're going to take one last question, and this has been so much fun that I think we'll go ahead and schedule it for next Friday as well. So any questions that didn't get answered today, we'll pick up with on next Friday. So last question is from South Africa.
Okay, Andreas Barth, greetings from Cape Town, South Africa. I own a 1951 Fender Broadcaster. How can I tell if the paintwork nitrocellulose varnish is original? Well, first, nitrocellulose is lacquer, not varnish. And second, 51 for a broadcaster would be unusual. Broadcasters typically are 1950. On this one, I would suggest that you might wish to get it appraised. We have an online appraisal service, which you can do through our website. If you go to the Gruhn website and click on the appraisal button on the home page for $75 with the photos and your description, we will do a detailed written appraisal. Now, no appraisal done from photos is truly equivalent to having it physically in hand. However, with good photos, the better the photos are, the better we can do for you. If you send high resolution photos, you can get a good appraisal. And our website is guitars.com, guitars.com. And if you wish to send more photos for an appraisal than the appraisal site will accommodate, you can send those photos to my associate who works in appraisals with me, Joe Spann, S-P-A-N-N, and his email is joe@gruhn.com. So if you send the photos, any extra photos, as many as you wish, just submit the appraisal through the appraisal site, and then extra photos to joe@gruhn.com, along with an explanatory note to him. We will get on it. And the appraisals are something we take very seriously. Joe works on them. I review every appraisal. So when my signature is on an appraisal, I have checked it. And we have a full staff to help with this. So, example, Lynn in our repair shop is very knowledgeable about early fenders, one of his specialties. So we have good ability to go through and offer an opinion on this. But so far as verbally, how can I tell you to know for sure whether a finish is original? The answer is I can't. Seeing it in person or with good photos, we can look at the distinctive look inside the chambers in the body. In other words, we want to see pictures of that guitar with the pick guard off, and we want to see inside the control cavity to see how it looks, because it is very, very difficult to do a refinish that does not look obvious in the control cavities. We also want to see close enough photos to see the pattern of the lacquer checking, which typically looks rather different on an old guitar than on a modern relic finish, or on some of the more modern finishes. Typically the lacquer checking pattern looks quite different. But there's numerous things we are looking for. And what I can tell you is that the more photos, the better. But we need to see a picture also with the neck off. We want to see the end of the neck, and we want to see the neck pocket in the body. So when we see all of that, we will be able to do a good appraisal for you. I look forward to next week. We will keep questions that haven't yet been answered so that I can still get to them. We're not going to ignore them. And I look forward to getting to know more of you each week.